I'm going to begin with a story in some detail that illustrates what a social finance fund can do. And I'll then conclude with the urgent opportunity for philanthropy, the public sector, and private capital to invest in promising solutions to a host of social and environmental challenges. So my story is about the Huron-Wendat First Nation outside Quebec City and their solution to the deplorable housing situation that exists on many First Nations reserves. Without title to their lands, Indigenous people living on reserves have no access to mortgage funds with which to build decent homes that they own. They depend on federal transfers to band councils, and when you have a limited budget with which to build as many homes as possible, the results are often substandard. Band councils control, what's more, who gets to live in those houses and for how long, and so with no security of tenancy, people can be evicted at any time. There is no incentive to look after the place where you're living. So the Huron-Wendat have developed a solution to this problem. They began by holding a referendum by which the community agreed to put their federal housing money into a community loan fund. That fund has made over 400 housing loans to band members, all at 7% interest, with a less than 2% default rate. They operate a school on the reserve that trains Indigenous youth from the community and farther afield to become carpenters, plumbers, and electricians. They have a thriving little business community with several social enterprises, some of them actually getting quite big. One of Canada's biggest manufacturers of snowshoes is in this community. However, the Huron-Wendat Housing Loan Fund has no access to market capital. Its loan fund is entirely committed, and repayments are insufficient to meet the increasing demand for new loans. So a Wendake-based First Nations owned and managed nonprofit called ABSCAN was created to fill that void. It raises First Nations savings through bonds in conformity with financial market authorities. And since 2005, they've raised and invested over $35 million in First Nations housing, including in the Wendake Housing Fund, with no losses or arrears to date. So they approached the McConnell Foundation to grow this model and replicate its success to other First Nations in Quebec first and eventually across Canada. We began by making two $25,000 grants to study and document this approach, and INAC matched those grants. And with that funding, they were able to put together the templates, the plans, the steps you have to take to move into this direction. And 2 years ago, we collectively raised $1.4 million to do 4 demonstration projects in 4 reserves. So that $1.4 million looked like this. So the foundation contributed $150,000 in further grant funding for capacity building in those 4 communities, and then a $350,000 zero-interest loan with which to seed housing loans. That was matched by INAC, and the Huron put in another $400,000 themselves from their own resources. So last summer, construction began on several individual homes and 1 multi-unit residence. This spring, all of those projects will be completed. And there are now 20 more communities who want to introduce this model. And the project needs $10 million to keep moving forward. That's too much for a foundation like McConnell, and it's too little for an institutional investor. To put it bluntly, what bank wants to make unsecured loans for housing on First Nations reserves? A social finance wholesale fund could accelerate this process and take it to scale, using grant funds to seed new ideas and approaches, blended finance, low-interest loans, loan guarantees, and so on, to test ideas and bring them up to another level. And then finally, a combination of patient capital with first loss provisions, loan guarantees, and so on, to enable investment at substantial scale. Now, by the government's own estimate, the housing deficit on First Nations reserves across Canada will reach 80,000 units by the end of the decade. The Huron-Wendat model may not be a solution for all of them, but even if it was only for 10% of those houses that need to be built, we're talking about a $2 billion opportunity that is not being addressed by conventional capital markets. This is but one example of where we need to integrate philanthropic, public, and private sector resources, including capital, but also other supports to address pressing problems. The granting economy cannot take care of these things on its own. Governments cannot easily take the kinds of risks necessary to foster innovation, but they can create incentives, help to scale promising solutions, and reduce regulatory barriers that inhibit innovation. The private sector has talent and financial resources to contribute too, and as Larry Fink of BlackRock observed recently, they have an obligation, an under-addressed obligation to the public good. I think it's important to understand the purpose of a social finance fund. One of its purposes is to level the playing field, to unlock latent human capital. The community sector, civil society, we have 80,000 charities in Canada and another 80,000 not-for-profits. We have the second largest civil society sector proportionally in the world, and there is a lot of capacity there. So working with people who are in community, who are in community leadership roles, but making those collective action initiatives possible. This is another social process tool, is to get the private sector at the table, bring in the public sector agencies, and work together with the community to start a conversation about how do we understand this situation? Where do we see opportunities to do things differently? What could we test? What hypotheses can we do? Let's go on learning journeys. Let's take some people from the community and go downtown to the government office where these decisions are made and talk to those people, and vice versa. This is our urgent opportunity. And building on examples like the Chantier de l'économie sociale, the Quebec model, social finance funds in other countries, we have a unique opportunity to improve lives, to generate world-leading social innovations, and advance our commitment and contribution to attaining the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.